Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. Today we are honored, I think, to have with us the editor of Newsweek magazine, Jon Meacham, who's promised not to talk about Newsweek, but rather to talk about his new book, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House. It's published by Random House. Thanks for stopping by.
Thanks for having me.
You've been in this biography business for a while, haven't you?
I have been. It's getting kind of out of hand.
American Gospel, God the Founding Fathers' Making of a Nation, Franklin and Winston, an intimate portrait of an epic. I like that epic friendship. That's very good.
Thank you.
And Voices in Our Blood, America's Best on the Civil Rights Movement, of which you were an editor in that case. What made you decide to take on Mr. Jackson? I think I know the answer, but I'll ask the question anyway.
I think he represents the best of us and the worst of us. And I was it was 2003. I just finished the book on Roosevelt and Churchill, and we were in that mode, that phase. Remember when McCullough had published John Adams, Walter Isaacson had published Benjamin Franklin, Joe Ellis's books were doing extremely well, and they were marvelous books, and I love all those men. But to my mind, Jackson is a more contemporary figure, more relevant to us than some of those other folks because of his flaws. He was capable of great good and great evil, often within the same hour. And he was...
Same sentence sometimes.
Oh, Lord. And so I really believed that the history of the country is ultimately a good and redemptive story. But the key emphasis in that sentence is on the word ultimately. And I wanted to find someone who represented, who embodied the contradictions at the heart of the American character. And there was no better embodiment than Jackson.
If you see him as a kind of different subject, it's very appropriate, I guess, that you begin the book in a different way. It's a very, very sad opening. His wife, he has just won the presidency, and his wife has just died.
His wife collapses on the 17th of December, 1828. He just found out he'd won the presidency. He was going to leave in about 3 weeks' time. They were going to leave in about 3 weeks' time to come to Washington. And she collapsed probably of a heart attack in the Hermitage there, his house. He was actually out. Interestingly, we have a letter that he started and was halfway through and left the house to walk around the plantation. By the time he came back, she had collapsed screaming in the house. He believed that the cumulative stress of the attacks on her sexual virtue, because he'd married her before her divorce from her first husband was final, a minor hiccup in the marital game, and it had been what had been okay 30 years before in the late 1790s in the frontier Southwest was not so much so 30 years later in national politics. And so she was attacked as a bigamist and a whore, and Jackson believed that had killed her.
And that immediately puts you into the whole notion of Jackson's understanding of family and the critical importance it had to him from, one would say, from that moment on. It was like that. And you recount an incident during the War of 1812 when he was in position to fight. They said, come on back. And there were X number of men sick and dying. And he said, should I die, I know they would bury me. On foot, he saw them home, and by the time they arrived in Nashville, they were calling him Old Hickory. Jackson had done what his own parents never had, stayed the course with those in his charge, delivered them from danger. He had done a father's work. And throughout, his notion of father is broad. It involves everybody, and even the nation, I guess.
Particularly the nation. You're exactly right. It's interesting not to project too much here or treat this as a therapy, because you might charge me. But it's interesting to me that I wrote this as I became a father 3 times over the course of this book. And so I think that did have some impact on how I saw Jackson. He never knew his father. His father died before he was born, which put him in an interesting presidential category. Presidents tend to either have a very strong father or no father at all. Obama has no father, Clinton, Ford, Jackson. And what he did is precisely what you just suggested. He began to see the country as his family. And I believe that it helps explain his passionate emotional connection to the Union and his passionate emotional connection to his wife's family, with which he surrounded himself his entire life.
And at one point in the story, he could not have any of them around in the White House, and he felt terrible. He was like sick.
I have been left to sup alone.
Oh, that's right. That's the title. An American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House. In this book, you're going to find many surprises. One of them, Old Hickory was really quite sophisticated. Want proof? Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House. The book is by Jon Meacham, published by Random House, and we're talking about it today on Conversations on the Coast. And a pretty fair country writer by the name of Doris Kearns Goodwin, a Pulitzer Prize winner, among other things, said this about this book. Every so often, a terrific biography comes along that shines a new light on a familiar figure in American history. Now, I don't think this guy's that familiar. I mean, never mind, I don't think I agree with that. So it was with David McCullough's John Adams. I mean, the rest of this is wonderful. So it was with Walter Isaacson's Benjamin Franklin. And so it is with Jon Meacham's Andrew Jackson. A master storyteller, Meacham interweaves the lives of Jackson and the members of his inner circle to create a highly original book. And that it is. And at the very way in the back of the book, beyond the footnotes, you talk about the kind of book that you wanted to write. You wanted to capture the man and at the same time all those around him. And it makes the book a little nonlinear, but fascinating.
Thank you. It's remember the line from Richard II, "Come, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings." To me, that's what this is about. And I think of myself as a biographer as opposed to a historian. Mm-hmm. And I think historian implies a kind of clinical element that I don't have, though I use a lot of historians are the backbone of the book. And my sense is that the human story of our leaders, the human story of the ordinary people of the time, are the most accessible ways to paint a portrait that will tell us something about not only their lives but ours. Because if you don't look back, you're not going to have much of a sense of how we got here mm-hmm. or where we're going to go. Sounds like an obvious point, and it is sort of an obvious point. However, we do have a tendency in America in particular to suffer from what I sometimes call superlativitis. That the present is always the most this and the most yes. We'll never get over this.
It's the worst. It's right. The best. It's the fastest. It's the slowest.
Right, and there's nothing new under the sun. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to tell the story this way.
This business about his being a sophisticated person, mm-hmm. that I really found that surprising. You introduced the notion when you're covering a kind of anecdote about a woman by the name of Julia Ann Connor, mm-hmm. and this is out of he was helping her in a game of chess. Sophisticated is not a word often used to describe Andrew Jackson, but it should be. The number of scandals that threatened to consume him between his admission to the bar and his election to the White House, martial law in New Orleans, the execution of mutineers in the field, invading Florida arguably without permission or proper authority, killing British subjects, his murky marriages, slaying of Charles Dickinson in a duel, the gunfight with the Bentons would have ended most political careers, yet Jackson endured and conquered. He knew how to make amends when he had to. possessed enough charm to turn longtime enemies into new friends. And I guess that's a hell of a good definition of sophisticated.
It is, I think. He was a very deft politician. He was also a hothead, but he was a hothead, and this is very important. And again, the child being the father of the man and all that. Remember, he came out of this orphaned childhood. He had no father. Even when he had no father, even when his mother was alive for 14 years of his life, he was a dependent in the houses in which he grew up. Mm-hmm. He was the poor cousin. And so he had to learn how to maneuver and manipulate situations in which he was not a welcome addition. And that requires a certain kind of political skill. He was very interested in and often quoted the letters of Lord Chesterfield, kind of an 18th century manners advice manual to young men who wanted to rise in the world. And one of the key lines that stuck with Jackson was, "Have apparent confidence in all, real confidence in none." Yeah. And that's one definition of a politician, too.
It certainly is. It certainly is. The notion of family in his political life, I think, had its apex in the story involving Margaret O'Neill Timberlake Eaton, a woman, I think we would say, of somewhat loose virtue.
Yes, I think she was probably not all she should have been in that department. I don't know. Sexual indiscretions are notoriously difficult to prove in real time, and we sure as hell can't prove them at this distance. Margaret Eaton was, to my mind, and for those Jane Austen fans out there, think back to Pride and Prejudice. Think Margaret Eaton as Lydia.
Okay.
Lydia Bennet, she was the one who ran off with Wickham. Mm-hmm. Margaret Eaton would have run off with Wickham if she'd had the opportunity. She was brash and bold. She was aggressive and ambitious. She was beautiful. But she was also a bit of a lout, I think is a good word. And to call her reserved would not be accurate. And the scandal over her reception in Washington society was something that led to incredibly controversial political ramifications. And for those who somehow doubt that, I suggest the Iliad.
We have to break away now, but by God, when we come back, I want to get the rest of the story of my friend Margaret O'Neill Timberlake Eaton.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC. Or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Jim Foster. It is Conversations on the Coast, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House. That's the book. Jon Meacham is our guest. He wrote it. And we have another person who liked the book a lot, Tina Brown. Tina Brown. Remember when she ran the New Yorker?
Absolutely.
Yeah. What passes for political drama today pales in the reading of Jon Meacham's vividly told story of our seventh president, who was a prime creator of the presidency as the fulcrum of executive power to defend democracy. Reading American Lion, one is no longer able to look on the gaunt, craggy face on the $20 bill without hearing the tumult of America in the making. And she's right. She's right. That's the big thing in the book. You do get the sense of the country growing, moving from, only the seventh president. That's early on.
We were barely a half century old.
That's early on. Now, finish the story about my dear friend Margaret.
Margaret Eaton. Margaret Eaton was the daughter of a Washington tavern keeper, and she had kind of a barmaid's view of the world, which was you had to make customers feel welcome. You turned into a bit of a flirt. She called herself a pet, which I think we would call a flirt now. And she married a Navy purser named John Timberlake. He slit his throat at sea.
Why did he do that?
He was upset, it is said, about her infidelities. That was the understanding.
Okay.
She marries John Henry Eaton, a very close friend of, and a son-brother kind of figure to go to the family point of Andrew Jackson. Jackson urged them to marry. Said one way to take care of the rumors is to marry the woman. Mm-hmm. And it became a litmus test in Washington whether you accepted the Eatons socially or not. Eaton was the Secretary of War. The cabinet was then made up of only 5 members, and so it was a much more intimate circle in government in those days. This is 1829 to 1837.
Right.
At the critical point in his early months, as he's trying to establish his reign and trying to put Washington under his control, he had this scandal unfolding, Jackson did, of a lot of cabinet wives refusing to receive Mrs. Eaton. And so after months and months and years, ultimately, of fights and brawls almost about it, including at one point the Secretary of War chasing the Secretary of the Treasury through the streets, planning to kill him. We think politics is bad now. I don't think we've ever seen that since. He sacked the entire cabinet and purged it, which was something that Europeans did. It wasn't something Americans did. And it does go to the theme of family because he wanted a harmonious circle around him, even in government terms.
And the political reason, or the governing reason, was, he said, oppose her and you oppose me and my policies. And that's where the family thing and the business thing, the political thing come together.
The political and the personal were one and the same to Jackson, and they were invested every situation, every possible situation with explosive possibilities.
Jackson had a lot of, long, tough problems to work on. The business about the Indians, the business of the U.S. Bank. But he had one problem that he solved very, very quickly, and that was his media problem. He didn't like the way he was being handled, so what did he do? He founded his own paper.
He founded his own newspaper. It would be like President Bush founding Fox News or Obama founding
That's
NPR.
That's one thing he didn't do.
That's
now,
true.
Come on.
That's true. But it was like having one's own website in the vernacular of the time. And so he began and maintained a conversation that is unfolding at this very hour between the president-elect of the United States and his followers in 2008, which is the conversation between the leader of a democracy and his followers. And Jackson believed, in a way that the first 6 presidents did not, that you had to be accessible, available, you had to be a character in people's lives, in the lives of your followers, because you would be calling on them at different times to make extraordinary sacrifices. And you couldn't just drop in and do that. You needed to build up capital, reserves of affection, reserves of respect. And the world we see with Senator Obama right now is the world that Jackson created.
And Jackson, had a belief in the primacy of the will of those people that he wanted to stay in contact with. And you in the book call this time the rise of democracy. Mm-hmm. A complex phenomenon whose causes extend beyond any one man. But it was Jackson who gave voice and force at the highest level to America's ever-widening hopes and aspirations. Democracy was making its stand. And that, I guess, is why you see him as so absolutely critical and important.
I think we lived in one America before Jackson was president and another when he left. And that's not always true of presidents, as you know. He really did lead us from being a republic to being a democracy. And you can argue with the wisdom of that. You can argue that a republic is a more enlightened way to rule, but if you were a common person, if you were someone who wanted to play a big role in the life of the nation, Jackson should be one of your heroes.
You can have a lot of fun reading this book, and you can learn an awful lot. The book is American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House, the author Jon Meacham. This is Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.